There's going to be at some point at which explanations break down, and you have to say, at least at this point in time, we don't have an explanation for that, and we may never have one. So I'm totally okay with the idea that there's going to be a limitation to questions, and even questions that science can eat around the edges of. Like, I think science can inform some of our discussions about morality, but I don't buy into Sam Harris's claim that science can answer moral questions. I think that's kind of silly. But I think science can inform moral questions, because I think that as someone who doesn't believe in the transcendent, I think that morality is going to be grounded in human nature, and psychology, biology, things like that are going to inform what that human nature is. But how we address that is going to have to be a philosophical, political, cultural discussion.
So the way that we come at questions, or the way that we try and process data, comes through a lot of our subjectivity. I mean, obviously we're all trying to process what we understand life is all about. But I think maybe we're trying to get here, Clayton, on some of what are the tools. So obviously our reason is one of those tools, and rationality, the use of evidence. But the question sometimes, when it comes to the question of atheism and the question of Christianity or other religions, Islam, Hinduism, or so forth, what qualifies as evidence? I mean, some people seem to think that faith is blind belief, where you basically believe things that ain't so. So faith is a projection onto the universe of what you want the universe to be like, rather than the Christian understanding that faith is a response to something that exists, the initiative of God, and you're putting your trust. I mean, if I put my faith in, in Andy, I have to believe that Andy exists, and then my faith would be that I trust what Andy says to me or does is reliable. So faith is not a blind extension. But when Lord Russell was asked, okay, should you die, and if there was a God, what would you say to him? And he would say, or why you didn't believe in Christianity, he'd say, not enough evidence. But my question, I think, and this is part of the whole postmodern search for reality, what qualifies as evidence? What is, just so that we know how wide or how narrow those boundaries are as to what's submitted as evidence.
I'm a big fan of the scientific method. It's in America, we basically work off of a capitalist society, where if you have a better business model than somebody else, then you are able to succeed. Science works very much the same way with regard to, like the Nobel Prize. Science works through observation. We gather evidence. We have a hypothesis. We test it, and then we give that data to other people. And those other people go through and they test that idea and verify that your hypothesis actually stands up, and that's a form of evidence. And we, through the scientific method, and going back to the Nobel Prize thing, if you do it correctly, if you do the scientific method correctly, then there's going to always be people out there that are going to try to see where you failed, where it could the answer be something different, and that's how people essentially win Nobel Prizes. So the scientific method, when done correctly underneath the criteria, the 7 steps, whenever those are done correctly, then that to me provides evidence. Is it testable? Can I claim a hypothesis and have somebody else test it without any kind of bias towards the outcome? And that to me is the evidence that we're looking for.
In every dimension of your life, or just in certain particulars, that you use a scientific methodology at all dimensions of your existence all the time.
I really try to do so. Now, of course, there's going to end up being instances where I don't have enough evidence to support a claim. And then that's where a kind of a faith kind of comes in, a belief, if you will. But faith, by definition, is believing in something for which there is no proof. Now, do I have evidence that my car starts every day? Yeah, my car is started every single day. Do I know for a fact that it'll start tomorrow? I don't know for a fact. Do I have to believe that it'll start? Yes, but I'm believing based off of prior evidence. But believing in something where you don't have any evidence is essentially a faith. And that's kind of the disconnect. And you're asking about evidence versus faith.
I think that's interesting. I think one of the things I'd want to pick up on there, and interesting as well, that the diversity within atheism is reflected on the panel. So I'd love to have, if we had more time, to have you two dialogue on science would be interesting. But I think I think one of the things I'd want to pick up on is I think the idea that, of course, faith is the opposite of evidence, that something you have when you have no evidence. I forget the exact phrasing you use. Is I think something we probably want to be careful about. That's a very common miscaricature of the way that the word faith operates. I recognise that Christians are sometimes added to that in the way that they've spoken, and I think which has given our atheist friends ammunition. But I think what's interesting, if you look even at what the word faith means, and you trace the root of that, it really means trust. Faith in the Bible and in the Latin idea, the Latin root of the word means to put your trust in something. The analogy I often use when I got married 16 years ago, I had some evidence that my wife, my fiancée then, was reliable. But there comes a point where you put trust, a degree of a priori, but also to a degree not. But even on the evidence that you have, you can decide whether or not to trust. The analogy I sometimes use is, if you're peering over the edge of the Grand Canyon. I'm a hiker. I love the outdoors, and so the Grand Canyon is one of my favorite places here in America. I'm peering over the edge of the Grand Canyon, and I get a bit too enthusiastic, and I fall over the edge, and I'm accelerating down towards the canyon floor, shortly to be a pizza-shaped sort of stain on the bottom. And as I accelerate down the side of the Grand Canyon, I notice a rather robust-looking tree root sticking out of the side. Now I've got a background in botany, perhaps, and I can immediately determine what sort of tree root it is. I also took a couple of engineering classes when I was at university, so I can very quickly calculate the forces that tree root will take. In fact, I can assess all kinds of information about it. But however much information I have, until I reach out and actually grab the thing, I haven't exercised faith. Faith is not antithetical to or opposite to evidence. The two are symbiotic. And I think that's true for atheism. I think it's true for Christianity. We need to be careful that neither side, I think, sort of try and suggest that one is guilty of operating on evidence alone or faith alone. I think that's where many miscommunications can arise.
Let's unpack it a little bit. Do you draw a distinction between faith in and faith that?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear you because the sound up here is terrible.
Do you draw a distinction between faith in and faith that?
I don't think I would be careful not necessarily to draw that distinction.
Okay. Because it seems to me that there's a useful distinction there. Faith in God is fine as long as you believe that a God exists. It seems to me that that's not problematic. But faith that a God exists would seem to me to need some other kind of justification.
Let me push back on that, not in an argumentative way, but I think this is important as we're discussing, realities and how we come to it. And I realize that from what I'm gathering in our pre-conversations, and I really appreciate your point of feeling like a minority in a community where you've been, atheists are and maybe treated with disrespect. And of course, I'm coming from the other side of the scale as a Scotsman, where basically religion is very, very weak in these days, and faith or Christianity is a minority religion, but still there. But to me, it wasn't about ideas so much as an encounter. So when you were saying about faith, I was having a crisis of something that happened to someone who said they had met the living God. Now, I'm living my life one day as a young man in Scotland, doing the party thing, working in a dance hall. I'm a bouncer, doing all this bit. And this girl suddenly comes and says, "What do you think about Jesus?" Well, to me, trust me, I didn't think anything about Jesus. That was just offensive and repulsive. No interest, no idea at all. But then she says she was converted, so I don't know what converted means. She become a 3-room and kitchen, or what happened, Something clearly did happen. It was an encounter. And of course the language is just weird, because I had no coordinates. I had nothing in my world that made sense to that. So when I first came to meet these people who had messed up my life, if you like, or her life, I went along it's like basically the brainwasher. I don't know if she'd been caught by some cult, some sect, or what they were. And I went along with pretty aggressive intentions to sort these people out. And I heard, of course, there was information shared. I talked about Marx and Freud and Nietzsche and all kinds of bits and pieces I would throw out there, a little bit of Darwinism. Not that I'd read much of it, but I had enough to know just to be dangerous. And of course they were firing Bible texts, which equally were like tennis balls bouncing off my head. I mean, who reads the Bible in that was the 20th century, this is the 21st now. That shows you how old I am. But basically, there came a point where I had this growing sense there was something in reality to what they said. Now, the existential moment for me, when I look at this now analytically, is that when I knelt and prayed and said, "God, I need to know you," something happened. Now, but let me just then I'll let you come back. The knowledge, I believe, an encounter began in which then other factors of knowledge had to come into play later on as I was trying to understand and unpack that. I could connect my experience to the experience of other people across history and locate it in Scripture, but not just in Scripture, in tradition that gave it veridical power, if you like. So I wasn't the only isolated individual, and it wasn't the only thing. But I can no more say to you, Clayton, that God is not real tonight or is a concept than I could say that Andy's not here to me. And so I'm arguing a little bit more that rather than a pure abstract philosophical concept, but coming at it from there's something there in the universe to which I responded, I believe, and that's the basis by which I would be coming at the question.
I'm curious how that same narrative that you talk about is really common in the U.S. in the Mormon faith. I think a lot of us here will have had experiences with Mormon missionaries, and I don't think they're very active in Europe. They're very active in the United States, and my conversations with Mormons, they talk a lot about something that's not entirely unlike Alvin Plantinga. Alvin Plantinga has this idea of the sensus divinitatis, I think that's the term, where he talks about, we have this inner sense of God if we go searching for it, and that it's veridical. It gives them gives you a kind of knowledge. Now I don't have that sense of knowledge. I wouldn't be an atheist if I did. But the Mormon community talks about an idea like that very heavily, and it's really key to their faith. Now, I know that you don't find the tenets of their faith to be, or I would assume you don't find most of what they claim theologically to be very valid. How do you, as a religious person, draw a distinction between people who make the claim that they have veracity and your claim of veracity?
Well, when I'm testing any truth claim or any worldview statements or anything, including my own experience, comparison is the mother of clarity. So I have to subject my belief, my experience, my understanding to tests of comparison and evaluation against its key foundations. My experience is not enough in which to base reality. The basis of that reality was that there was a God out there to exist in response, that Jesus had come in the flesh, that Christ had died for our sins, that he had risen, and I could have an encounter with him. Now, as you said, other people have religious experience, but I could only test mine against the evidences that I have. Now, so when I look at other texts, I look at the authors, the reliability, I look at the evidential support for their claims, I look at the historicity, the transmission, and I see if they're reliable. I don't think Christianity, as I understand it, and Mormonism have remotely the same evidential basis. Else I would indeed become a Mormon. If I felt Islam had more evidential basis, then I would become a Muslim. So I've looked personally at these things through critical lenses as best I can, and we've sat, as Andy has said, we've listened to people share with us and come back with their own arguments against and for their faith. And at the end, just like you gentlemen, we have to make a judgment based on what the evidence as we see it, as we summarize it, as we weigh it, and still live. And for me, as I said, this faith makes sense. But going back to this issue of civility, I think it's helping us to understand that there are reasons for these things. I feel you have reasons for not believing, and we have reasons, and they seem very real to us, right, or else we wouldn't be believing it, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
I was going to say, let me add something, if I may. I mean, I sort of picking up from something Stuart said there. I said in my opening piece that I mentioned Speaker's Corner in London, and that was in a sense instrumental to my faith, because when I went to Speaker's Corner as a young Christian in the mid-1990s, I sort of somewhat cockily got onto a ladder and thought I could sort of take on 250 Muslims and preach on the street and persuade them of what I believe was true. And I discovered that wasn't really the case. And they quite nicely tore me to pieces, filleted me, asked me lots of questions I couldn't answer, and sent me home looking stupid. Everyone should be humiliated in public at least once. It's a great experience. It's part of the British national character, really. That's why we go to international sporting events. And but what I did, I remember going home and thinking to myself, perhaps I need to become a Muslim because they have all of the answers, I have none of them. And as I lay awake that night tossing and turning, my long-suffering wife kind of elbowed me in the ribs about 3 a.m. and said, "Why are you tossing and turning and keeping us both awake?" And I told her my sorry little story, and her sage advice was, "Well, why don't you read a book, ideally in the morning?" And so what that did is that forced me to actually begin putting my faith to the test. I'd never done that. I confess I had never to that point done that. And so I set out to go, okay, are the things that I believe true, and to follow the evidence where it leads? And I went back to Speaker's Corner 3 weeks later with answers to many of the questions, and they had new questions, and they made me look stupid all over again. But going through that process, and to a lesser extent with atheist friends and Marxist friends at Speaker's Corner, it really was a case of coming out going, okay, it's been a hard journey, but I'm increasingly convinced that the things I believe are true. And I've carried that journey on. That's why I did a PhD in Islam, really, was to push some of this stuff through. And I think one of the interesting questions is really, can you take what you believe, and can you, subject it to scrutiny? But also, can you live it out? I think that's one of the other huge questions. We talk about the intellectual level, Stuart referred to the existential, but there's also the living out. And so one of the questions I guess I would sort of turn around to you guys, and I'd love to get your take on. I suggested that one of the questions that, as well as who is God, is there a God, that's important, is the what does it mean to be human question. We touched on that a little bit with, I know, Red, what you said about sort of brain science and mind and brain and those kind of issues. I guess the question I'd love to hear your take on is what do you think as atheists, representatives of the atheist community? I know just representatives, you would say, not for everybody. What do you think it means to be human? What's your answer to that question as an atheist, and how does that then unpack in the real world? What does it mean to be human?
Obviously, a very philosophical question. The problem that I run into with that is that I am simply a human. I'm species. I am the same difference that's with me, philosophically speaking, is the same difference that dogs end up thinking that, what does it mean to be a dog? What does it mean to be a human? And then you get into the idea of responsibility as a human. What is your responsibility to others and to yourself? And I come from a very science-heavy background, philosophy, so honestly this type of a question is better for Mr. Clayton here to be able to answer. So I will actually pass it on to him for that, because to me, to be human isn't really a well-defined question. I don't really understand the parameters of what you're asking in that sense.
You sound more like a Canadian, actually, but...
I will leave out the jokes.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack with that question, because it's a broad question. I mean, there's going to be I don't think you would have a problem with it. There's going to be a scientific element to that, which is, I don't think that, I think we evolved, we are animals, we have historically contingent, evolutionary, cultural, and, we have a history, so that's going to shape that question. I think that you're, of course, trying to get at something deeper than that, which is, meaning, a sense of something above and beyond the base animal. And I'm fine with being called a naturalist, by the way. You can call me a naturalist. I don't have a problem with that term. As a naturalist, I don't believe in the existence of a transcendent. So science is going to go a long way toward informing that question. We have a psychology and things like that. I am not uncomfortable with, there's a tendency within religious communities to say that humans are something higher, or, we're not, we're above the animals. I think it's more reasonable to say that we are a kind of animal who is able to think about things in ways that other animals aren't. And that we can, because of that, we can ask questions that other animals can't. And that gives us the opportunity to move into a sphere of discussion where we can create meaning in our lives, where we can talk about ethics. And so to be human is partly psychological, but it's also going to be largely ethical and philosophical. And I'm happy to elaborate on what my particular ethical views and views about meaning are, but yeah, humans are animals who can ask questions other animals can't, and can do things that have a kind of meaning that other animals can't have, just because it just happens to be that way because of our evolutionary history and our historical contingencies, and we're lucky in that sense. We can ask those questions, but there's not a kind of transcendent meaning above and beyond, and there's not some kind of transcendent sense in what it means to be human for me.
Well, you may have been watching this program and wondering, why did we go about it this way? One of the goals that we are deeply convinced as a ministry is that civility is not it's not a posture, it's not a concept, it's a way of life. So we have to treat each other with respect. I think you'll notice on both sides of this equation that civility was granted both in how we said things and what we said, and we really appreciated our atheist guests, or guests as we were together in university, tackling these conversations in a way that was respectful to the individual, also to the ideas, and yet invited a dialogue. Subsequently, as we gathered together, we were able to shake hands, to talk to each other, and keep friendship. The people in Oklahoma have continued to nurture these relationships and stay in touch. Now, there are differences, and there were content differences. And one thing that strikes me at times is that we need to deal with things like the so-called myth of neutrality, as if science and rationality is a neutral zone and that people of faith have if you like, biases and so forth. It was clear that there's no neutral position. Everybody starts from a position of somewhere. The second thing is we also notice a tendency to fix the rules as to how or how not the dialogue should unfold. So rather than actually working towards an answer, we try to assume one and then argue from it. And that leads us to the third thing, which is cherry-picking the evidence. Something is allowed in and some data is